as a live response to George Bush, but the bloodthirsty rhetoric could have been recorded hours or even days earlier.
Use your swords. Don't be afraid. Don't fear anybody. Use your swords.
The American planes that fired the first shots of this campaign have been arriving back aboard their ships. There are more air raids to come before British and American ground forces make their move. So the waiting is not quite over, even though the war has started. Kevin Connolly, BBC News.
OK, well, let's go back to Baghdad now. Our correspondent, Raghi Omar, is still there for us. Raghi, as we were talking earlier, you were saying the attacks took place just before dawn. It's the middle of the morning there now. What is the situation in Baghdad?
I've just been down onto one of the main streets right in the heart of the city by the Tigris River that flows through Baghdad. It's pretty much utterly deserted, actually, although there are just a few cars, civilian cars, making their way home or perhaps going to visit relatives. But on the whole, the street remains utterly deserted. Many people, for obvious reasons, deciding just to stay at home with their relatives, with whatever supplies they have. And I think many of them will be expecting that when the war begins in earnest, so to speak, and the aerial bombardments begin, that is when it will not be safe at all to leave their homes. But they're not taking any chances. It may have begun with an opportunistic strike here and there, but I think most people are presuming that that could change at any minute.
Raghi Omar in Baghdad, thank you very much.
Well, a Reuters correspondent is reporting in the last few minutes that he heard 24 explosions, apparently mortars from the inside of Iraqi's southern border. The British and the American forces are being coordinated from the command centre in Qatar. Our defence correspondent, Paul Adams, is there for us this morning. Hello to you, Paul. And we're hearing from one American official this morning that it is a limited thing, quote, "It ain't A-Day." The attacks seem to have taken everybody by surprise.
Certainly took everyone here by surprise, obviously barring a few people who were controlling this. Interestingly, you'd think of this as a coalition in which everyone's working side by side. But the British, I have to say, were completely in the dark about this. The officials I spoke to were as stunned as we were. They knew nothing about it. We do know that Tony Blair was informed. It is possible that the British commander here, Brian Burridge, knew about it, but not too many other people, it seems. It took everyone by surprise.
It is often said, isn't it, that the first casualty of war is truth. We have to filter through all information, but what are you being told this morning?
Well, we know now pretty much how the operation was launched. We know that there was something in the region of 3 dozen Tomahawk cruise missiles fired from the Persian Gulf and also from the Red Sea. We also know that a handful of night F-117 fighter bombers were involved in launching precision-guided munitions over Baghdad. Those are the nuts and bolts of it. Interestingly, when one thinks about cost, that salvo of cruise missiles, I calculate, probably cost the Americans $24 million. So already the war has begun. But as we are saying, this is not the start of the big massive operation that we've been led to believe, in which we would see much more activity in the air and, of course, a big push on the ground. That may still come.
Paul, we're also hearing reports coming in this morning that these surgical strikes were aimed to decapitate the regime, as it were, and some people suggesting that actually if they got rid of the main leaders, Saddam Hussein and his right-hand men, as it were, it would possibly prevent the rest of the campaign going on.
There has always been a feeling, indeed a hope, that that is how this could happen and it save everybody an awful lot of grief. If they could decapitate the regime, take out the key members of the regime, then the rest might simply capitulate. There is a sustained effort going on. It's been going on for months already to persuade the Iraqi military to give up, that it's simply not worth fighting when the time comes. That effort continues with broadcasts, with leaflet drops, an awful lot of propaganda designed to achieve this effect. We are being told over and over again, we have no intention of waging war on the Iraqi people. We want to avoid having to inflict civilian casualties. We will do this with the minimum possible bloodshed. Thus, when this opportunity arose to launch a strike, which they believed might take out key members of the Iraqi regime, we don't know if it's worked, but when that opportunity arose, they took it with alacrity.
And Paul, also hearing reports this morning of some artillery fire on the Iraqi-Kuwaiti border. Are you able to tell us any more about that?
I'm afraid not, because at the moment we are in a kind of lockdown here. There's very little information being given out. I'm speaking to you from the briefing centre where the information, when it finally does start to flow, will be released. This is what they call the Hollywood set. This has been built at enormous expense with plasma screens, with podiums. It's all ready for the big show when it happens. This is where Tommy Franks and Brian Burridge, his British counterpart, will do their briefings. But at the moment, no one here has got anything to say to us.
Paul Adams, we'll leave it there and check in with you shortly. Thank you.
OK, so the air raids on Baghdad have been met with a defiant television address from Saddam Hussein, urging the Iraqi people to resist. Our World Affairs editor, John Simpson, joins us now from northern Iraq. So, John, what do you make about this almost immediate response by Saddam Hussein? First of all, was it genuine?
Yes, I think it was genuine. I think that was definitely Saddam Hussein. Of course, he has doubles. We know that. It's been pretty much proven. But his doubles don't make the big speeches. This is, after all, one of the great speeches of Saddam Hussein's life, possibly the last great public speech of his life. That's not the kind of thing he would easily give to a double. And if he'd been killed in that attack, I'm sure that they wouldn't have had a double making a speech like that. It looked as though he was reading from his own notes, which he'd jotted down in a notebook, rambling, repetitious, as Saddam so often is on these things. After all, nobody tells him to keep his remarks short. And it looked to me as though it was his response, his sort of, his way of saying that, putting himself on a par with George Bush, his equivalent of what George Bush said, speaking obviously to the international audience of people who sympathize with him, particularly in the Arab world, but also, I think, speaking in his sense to history. It was a bad performance, but nevertheless it was an important one.
Was he also joining in that battle for the hearts and minds of ordinary Iraqis? The Americans, of course, laying great store about by the psychological side of this whole operation.
Yes, I think that's perfectly reasonable to expect. The trouble is, of course, from his point of view, he's done this many times before, but particularly in 1991, and ordinary Iraqis simply weren't prepared to make the kind of sacrifices that their leaders would hope that they would make. It's difficult, really, to say, but I think that Saddam, for instance, I mean, he's an extremely courageous man. In the 1991 war, his head of military intelligence, who later defected, told me that he drove around the outskirts of Baghdad the whole time in one small red Passat Volkswagen with a single armed guard, and that he met his ministers at villages